Hello, everyone. I'm Osama Rahman. I am Director of the Data Science Campus at the Office for National Statistics. And I'm here today to introduce our speaker, Professor Rohini Pande, which I'll do properly very shortly. And now, first of all, can I say it is brilliant being in the second greatest city on the planet for this conference. And for the avoidance of any doubt, the greatest city is where? Less than a mile away on the other side of the Orwell. So just for the avoidance of any doubt. Now, many people here might be surprised why here at ESCoE today we've got several sessions around issues of measurement in developing countries and developing issues. But actually at the ONS, we do some work in developing countries, whether it's building capability in statistical institutes in developing countries, or working with various governments to help them use alternative data sources to do things like measure the number of people in displaced persons camps, measure tree coverage, which will come up in Professor Pande's talk, measuring wealth in terms of counting cows from space. There's all sorts of interesting things we do. But I think there's very interesting broader issues as well around sort of measurement of poverties, drivers of activity or lack of activity in the labor market, access to resources, measuring the impact of climate change, which is one of the things we're going to hear about very shortly. And many of the issues development economists look at are directly relevant to those working in developed country context, where they're looking at GDP and beyond, or environmental degradation, or labor market participation. And actually, in some areas, development economics has been the pioneer. So if you look at a lot of the stuff around measuring intra-household resource allocation, a lot of that initially came out of work in development. So even for those not working in development, a lot to learn. So our guest speaker is Professor Rohini Pande, who, at least in the development economics world, needs no introduction. But for those of you not familiar with the development economics world, Professor Pande is the Henry J. Hines II Professor of Economics in the Department of Economics at Yale. And she's also director of the world-famous Economic Growth Center, which I suspect a lot of people will know about, which is also at Yale. Now, a lot of her work is focused on how both formal and informal institutions shape power relationships and patterns of economic, political, and environmental advantage in society, with a particular focus in developing countries. She's also very interested in the role of public policy in providing the poor and disadvantaged with political and economic power, and how notions of economic justice and human rights can help justify and enable such change. A lot of her recent work has been on testing innovative ways to make the state more accountable to its citizens, such as strengthening women's economic and political opportunities, ensuring that environmental regulations reduce harmful emissions, which will be focus of her talk today, and providing citizens with effective means to voice their demand for state services. She's the 2018 recipient of the Carolyn Bell Shaw Award from the American Economic Association, which is for promoting the success of women in the economics profession. She's the co-chair of the Political Economy and Government Group at JPAL, which is the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, and is a board member of the Bureau of Research on Economic Development, and is a former co-editor of the Review of Economics and Statistics. Before Yale, she was the Rafiq Hariri Professor of International Political Economy at the Harvard Kennedy School, where she co-founded Evidence for Policy Design. As I mentioned today, she's going to talk about environmental issues, and particularly around the vital issue of building integrity into the use and trading of carbon credits. And she's going to talk about creating a more functional structure for this market, including standardized high-quality measurement procedures and incentives for accurate reporting. So clearly issues of great interest to all of us. So I should shut up because you're not here to see me, and hand over to Professor Pande.
Thank you, Osama, for that very generous introduction, and thank you for the organizers to invite me. It's great to be back here and to see many familiar faces in the audience. So what I'm going to talk about today is, as Osama said, is really in some ways a set of ideas or proposals about what we may want to do with voluntary carbon markets, which I think are an important feature of how we think we're going to affect climate change. But currently, these markets are in a lot of trouble. And I think one of the reasons why they're in a lot of trouble, which is why I thought it would be a great place to talk and discuss with everyone in the audience, is around issues of measurement. So, I'm going to come back quite often to this idea of emission markets. And so to remind you, the basic feature of all emission markets is the idea that you can trade emissions both spatially, but importantly also often across time, which is important when you start thinking about wanting to, for instance, keep carbon in the ground. Now, a critical feature of any of these emissions markets, either current or ones that are trying to prevent more emissions from occurring, is about having data about this. And this data is critical for market players to use this information to come up with what the potential price is. And one of the issues that I'm going to come back to is this is also a setting where, especially in voluntary carbon markets, the very act of how carbon is measured is actually a source of revenue for several. And this very often in this market, as in many other markets where there's auditing or verification, can lead to a conflict of interest if those market players who benefit from a certain level of emissions being shown are also the ones who are paying for that data to be collected. The second issue is that even when you have unbiased measurement, that in itself isn't necessarily enough to set a price. One thing we need to know is whether these programs or projects that are being used to, say, keep carbon in the ground are actually doing that more so than would have happened under business as usual. And as economists, we typically think of this being a situation where we need a counterfactual. And so a second part of what I'm going to try to talk about is the importance of beginning to think about how for these carbon trading platforms or markets, we need to start thinking about where are we going to get a measure of what this counterfactual is. And so what I want to do about in this talk is really introduce you first to some of the measurement issues that are currently plaguing this market, and then offer some potential solutions. It's very, I'd say, open-ended right now, what I think may be solutions. And so I love to engage and probably even course correct some of my suggestions for this market. But just to remind you sort of what we're talking about, I think some of these pictures you've probably seen somewhere. So, I think, for instance, the one that most of us probably see is when we're taking a flight and we're feeling kind of guilty about the next flight we're taking, you'd very often get something like this where they'll tell you, okay, choose the number of hours of your flight, figure out how many tons of greenhouse gases are going to get emitted, and just offset it. This is very appealing. You feel that sort of you can just pay a little bit of money and not very much, right? So for $31, I could have offset my flight to come here from the United States and not done much harm to the environment. This is a market that is, and we'll talk a lot more about it, is what we call a voluntary carbon market. There's some set of people who are providing these projects, for instance, planting trees or preventing deforestation. That's going to allow me to spend $31 and offset my flight. So where did this market come from? What is the background of it and how does it function? So as you know, a lot of the kind of environmental regulations have come out through a set of protocols agreed at different COP and other meetings. So under 2013, we had the Clean Development Mechanism come up, which allowed especially lower income countries to earn a certain amount of credit for every ton of CO2 that they prevented from reaching getting into the atmosphere. Building on this, under 2015, under the Paris Agreement, we saw the majority of the world's countries agreeing to say that they would reduce carbon emissions, and that if they exceeded their targets, so if they were a carbon negative country, for instance, they could sell these emissions to other countries. But importantly, and this was, one of the failures of COP28 last year, we don't actually have an agreement of how these trades are going to work or how these sales are going to work. There's Article 6, but it has not approved of any formal exchange. So as a result, all of these trades we are seeing are voluntary trades. So what do we need in order for this market to function? As economists, we'd say, well, if you want to have a market to do it, you need two things. First, you need accurate emissions measurements. So you're going to be able to measure what exactly are the reductions associated with any project. And second, and importantly, I think this is something that hasn't yet happened, which is why the price was only $31 for me to offset my flight, is that you need to think about what are the remaining emissions that the world can afford if it's going to remain below, say, 1.5 degrees, which was the Paris Agreement, right? So this is in some ways talking about a set of emissions that haven't yet happened, and use that as saying that's the total supply of emissions we have. So again, going back to the graph I showed you, there the calculation was just saying, this is the price you can get emissions at today. This is how you can offset your price. But there was no accounting in that market for the fact that my emissions are going to count against just the total emissions that the world can afford if it's going to remain under 1.5 degrees. And I think that's a trickier issue for markets to solve, and that one that I'll come back to towards the end. So, I mean, just to foresee, what we're not seeing is either of these. We're not seeing accurate emissions reduction measurement, and nor are we seeing a use of these of the remaining emission space for price setting, right? So what do we see as a set of players? So let me give you a sense of what the market looks like right now. So we have demand from emitters. So this could be any of us as individuals. Very often it's large companies who've also set net zero goals. They're demanding carbon offsets. It's too expensive for them to reduce their own emissions. Or if you're a flight company like Delta, you just can't reduce emissions. That's your business model. So they're demanding it. The suppliers are going to be project developers, very often in poor countries. So this will be someone who says, I have land. I will make sure that there will be no reduction of forests on my land. And then the emitters are going to purchase these carbon credits projects, usually through a system of brokers. So these are the brokers who are going to partly play a role of verifying that actually this is a true project and it's actually going to reduce emissions. And then finally, importantly, we don't have any regulators in this market. What we have is carbon credit registries. So these are platforms that will track the carbon credits produced by projects. And the aim is that they're the ones that are supposed to maintain the validity of these credits, avoid double counting, so two people don't say that they both use the same emissions reductions, and ensure trading occurs. So I'm sure some of these names you recognize. Most importantly, you recognize some of the buyers like JetBlue or Lyft. Brokers are maybe less known. South Pole is the one well-known one. Then the developers, you can see they come in different spaces. Red Plus, which is forest development, has one of the better known ones. And then we have these registries. One of them, Vera, has been in the news quite a lot recently, but they're the ones that are responsible for verification. This market has really boomed. So between just 2020 and 2021, it rose in value from $520 to over $2 billion. But as I said, the market is not regulated. And what we see, as you saw on the last slide, there are multiple registries. There's no single registry. You can go to multiple registry. Different certifications require different prices. And usually it's either the registries or the project developers or the brokers who are going to pay for the auditors to check their measurement. And each of these is actually going to benefit from selling more credits. So each of them has value from an auditor or a verifier who's actually going to show more emissions. And the returns to reputation in this market are relatively low right now. So this just shows you the surge we see. And what it shows you on the right is just the number of types of carbon credits. So this is probably out already, but there are over 170 different types of carbon credits you can buy. And one of the striking features is, if you think of all of them are trying to do the same thing, which is reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and a ton of carbon anywhere in the world is going to have the same effect. We should expect in a well-functioning market, a carbon credit should trade at a single market clearing price. Instead, we see each of these carbon credits are trading at very different prices. So we're going to have very cheap credits and more expensive credits, and that in itself is a sign that this market is not functional. There is not a single market clearing price here. So what this shows you is, over the last, starting 2022, there was a set of first papers, and starting with one in Science, and then reporting by The Guardian and a number of other outlets, stating the fact that very often the quality of certification was very poor. That headline is from a New Yorker article that talks about the South Pole as the broker, and the problems with Vera as a registry company for a set of African projects. This shows you both the rise in the average prices and then the dramatic fall in the stock prices of carbon offset market. And in March 2023, Delta actually, I think interestingly now, as a buyer of credit, started facing lawsuits from customers saying that you said you were going to make this net zero, but we don't. But the data suggests this is not the case. Right? So before I turn to kind of what I think were the reasons for the failure, I want to just highlight a few measurement questions, especially given this audience, that I think are at the heart of what has not been resolved in this market and why the market isn't functioning well. One of the most important elements is this idea of additionality. For us to want to, the underlying idea of a carbon credit is that it's going to ensure additionality, in that a carbon project is going to ensure that there are going to be reductions that would not have occurred in the absence of these carbon credits. So the money from the carbon credit is, for instance, preventing deforestation that would have otherwise occurred in business as usual. If you then take this and you say you retire this credit, the idea is you're going to keep some forest into perpetuity. However, if this doesn't happen and you're going to purchase credits from a non-additional source, you're going to make no difference to the emissions. So a key question for this market is who is deciding how much additionality is with the project and what is actually the methodology being used. Right now, what typically happens is that we get what we call engineering estimates. So I will look at a piece of forest and say, okay, if this forest is not going to be cut down, this is how much carbon that is not going to go into the air. But there is no real question of being asked, in the absence of this credit, maybe this would never have been cut down in any case. And so there's very limited attention, this kind of engineering estimate, to thinking about a counterfactual. Three other issues that come up, and I'm going to argue they're of differing importance. So the first one that actually a lot has been made of in the literature, but perhaps maybe we should make a little bit less of, and I'll come back to this, is this notion of permanence. So for how long are you going to manage to keep the carbon in the ground by buying a carbon credit? This is usually something that's measured in years. And a lot of people believe that unless you ensure that this is a permanent, that this forest, for instance, will never be cut down, you should not enter the carbon credit market with it. Others argue that you can have some time horizon over which this will be kept in the ground, and that should show up in the discounted price. The second, which I think is critical, and it's something I think economists have thought about this a lot, is the notion of leakage. I may pay for not deforesting a certain part of a certain forest, but what if they instead go and cut down some other forest? This may even, in the extreme case, this will even show up as looking like a lot of additionality for me if I compare with the place that was cut down, but really is just spillovers from one place to another. And then finally, I think this is something that a lot of the non-transparency in the system is contributing to right now, is that we very often have quite a lot of double counting. So there's a concern that because a lot of the trades right now are over-the-counter trades and not transparent, we don't actually know whether the same project isn't being sold multiple times. So as I talked about already, when we think about this issue of how additionality is done, we come to a concern of a conflict of interest, right? These verifiers are auditors. First of all, is the formula being used, I think, is not something that takes into account individual behavior at all. And I'll give you an example to show why that might matter. But also importantly, these verifiers and auditors are usually being paid by project developers or registries and have incentives to ensure high additionality. One of the things that people often ask is, how is the baseline being set? So if you set the baseline of the project to be very high, saying this is the amount of forest that there is, then the reductions in it are going to show up as a lot of additionality. So what does this show here? So as I said, kind of what are the market outcomes that we are seeing? So this is just showing you the amount of volume of emissions that are being prevented by the carbon offset market currently. And I think the key thing I want you to take away is that this is well below its potential. So right now, the best estimates for 2021, at the time when the market was booming, is that this voluntary market was preventing something like 0.8% of greenhouse gas emissions. If you put it in the context that deforestation itself accounts annually for something between 8 to 18% of greenhouse gas emissions, this is just a sign that even if things are functioning well, it's functioning at a very low level. And I think one of the reasons functioning at a low level, even when it was surging, is a lot of questions from buyers about what's going on here. This I've already referenced, which is, this is the first thing that I think any economist will look at and say, wow, what's happening here? The prices are hugely different. So renewable energy, we keep hearing about how prices have fallen so much. One of the implications of that is that it's also fallen in price in the offset market. In contrast, something like carbon sequestration, or when you're going to, where the technology isn't very developed and you need a lot of upfront technologies, we are still seeing that the carbon offset prices associated with that are very high. But if we think that all of them are doing the same thing in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, they should be a single price. Instead, what's happening is the price is reflecting a lot how far along you are in the investment chain for that area. And so in something like removals, there's going to be an underinvestment in new technologies because people are not going to buy those offsets. They're going to buy the much cheaper renewable energy offsets. And even if you took the highest price, this highest price that we're seeing in this market is something like 10 times below just the lower bound of the estimates of social cost of carbon that we are seeing in the literature right now. And so just to summarize, the voluntary carbon market is not setting a single price, and there's a lack of credibility and predictability. As a result of this, we see very often low prices, and this is constraining investment in several of the activities that we would want to see being supported. So what I want to do now, and I think this is where the development part of the talk comes in a bit, is I want to kind of talk through a set of studies that have helped us see how we can answer different aspects of the problem. They're not all solutions that can be directly or immediately applied to solving the problems, but I want to show you how we've addressed similar issues in other areas. And then I hope we'll have time in the end to maybe brainstorm together on how these ideas could be taken forward. So I'm going to talk about 3 different ideas. So the first is measuring additionality. And so here I'm going to use an example from payment for ecosystems, which is one of the classic ways in which carbon offsets are often generated. So you pay a set of farmers or villagers to not cut down forests. And I want to show in some ways, it's perhaps something that we will not be able to do for every project, but certainly should be what we think of as, I don't know, the lodestar of where we want to go in how we create a counterfactual. And so that's going to be an example from a colleague's work in Uganda. I want to then talk about I think a problem that I think is actually much easier to fix, which is addressing the conflict of interest. And I want to give you some evidence to show you just how much difference to measurement you can have by addressing this problem. And then finally, and I think that's the most open-ended part, I want to propose that perhaps we want to start thinking about compliance markets, even when we're thinking about carbon offsets. So right now we have kind of 2 different ways of addressing the carbon problem. One is compliance markets like the EU emissions trading system, where firms that are emitting buy and sell permits conditional to a cap, overall cap. This is a very well-regulated market and is, I think, has been quite successful where it's been implemented well. And then we have the separate market of voluntary carbon offsets, which is completely deregulated, there is no cap. So there is no way in which the total emissions budget left to the world is entering and setting the price or how much can be done. And I want to start thinking about, I think it's going to be complicated, but I think we should start thinking about whether we can actually start moving this sort of carbon offset or carbon credit, carbon removal market into one that has some features of a compliance market. Let me first talk about how and whether we can measure additionality. And while I realize that for not every project one can do an experiment, I think the minimum this should move your prior on is why engineering estimates are unlikely to provide the right answer. So this is a paper that was published in the Science a few years ago by a colleague of mine, Seema Jayachandran, and some co-authors called Cash for Carbon. So what they do is they worked with a Nature Conservancy organization in Uganda and had the following field experiment. So households were offered 70,000 Ugandan shillings per hectare annually in return for conserving their forest. It was a randomized control trial, so they took 121 villages, and the experiment ran for 2 years. And the way of measuring the impact of this program, which is actually one that's done very often in carbon offset programs, was to look at the change in land area cover from remote sensing or satellite data. So in general, I think this idea that you can measure forests from satellites now has been often a source of, I think, correctly, of excitement and thinking about measurement for PS programs. But as you'll see, that in itself, without a counterfactual, is not very useful. So this just shows you what it looks like from a satellite. So here you can see basically the plots being drawn out. In the green are the treatment plots. So these were owners of these plots of land were offered 70,000 shillings for no deforestation. And in the green are the control areas, which are often contiguous. One of the nice features of having a treatment control that's so contiguous is that they can also then measure leakage or study the extent to which, when treatment sees less, does it actually just go over to the control area. So what do they find? So they find that basically tree loss was halved by the payment for ecosystems. So the nice thing of having a field experiment is that you could just directly compare the average effect 2 years later in the plots that were often very close to each other. And so they find a halving of PS, of tree reduction. And importantly, they test for leakage. So they ask basically, do they see, say, a move over in the control areas, and don't actually find any evidence. I think a few things away from this study. First of all, this actually is, as I said, it's a gold standard that we may not be able to do in every instance, but it does perhaps suggest that for something like, for instance, setting the pricing level of a PES system, you could have an initial experiment where you look at the effects and you actually understand how sensitive is individual behavior to the price you're setting per hectare. You can then perhaps roll it out more broadly without needing to evaluate all the time. But now at least you have some proof of concept about the level of payments that are needed. The second thing that is important is by doing a real world example, you can calibrate engineering estimates much better. One of the key parameters that you need to make assumptions about is that when you provide this kind of program, how many people in the treatment area will take it up, right? In an engineering estimate, you're either saying it's 0 or 20 or 100% with no real sense of why you're setting that number. Here, for instance, they found that given the payment of 70,000 shillings, take-up was actually, it was reasonable. It was around 50%, slightly below 50%. That again gives you an estimate by which you can scale any cost benefit estimates that you're taking forward. Now, the kind of issues, and in each of these examples I'll talk about, there will be a set of issues that we will need to talk about. The kind of issues here that I think you need to talk about is obviously the cost of evaluations, right? And the timing. So here, it's taking 2 years, 70,000 shillings. They also did the long run study and found that actually the moment you remove the PS, people started cutting their trees. So again, I think how you extrapolate beyond your study period is going to be important. But as I said, I think, it's almost like you need some central group that's going to think hard about where are the returns from these kind of evaluations high. And in work, for instance, that I've done on PES in India, I did find that some of these features are very important to understand when there is perhaps no additionality at all. So I think deciding how to do it and where to do it is important. So to give you the example I was talking about, I worked, in fact, with SEMA and some others on a payment for ecosystems where we were trying to reduce crop burning by farmers. So this is across North India, between where there's multi-cropping between the two crops. The cheapest way for farmers to get rid of stock is to burn the field. This leads to both immediate air pollution, also quite a lot of black carbon, which contributes to greenhouse gases. It turns out in this setting, if you just did a standard payment for ecosystems, which is where you just pay the farmer if they don't burn the crop, there was zero additionality. So that was the case where the PS didn't work, possibly because the amount of money we'd set too low, or possibly because there were issues of liquidity. This was not, so in a deforestation example, you just have to choose to do nothing. You don't need money for it. You're just saying, I'm not going to cut down a tree. To actually prevent crop burning, you need to figure out how are you going to invest in something that's going to get rid of the residue? And that's going to be more expensive than burning. So what we found is the only kind of payment for ecosystem that worked was one that had partial upfront payment. This is not intuitive to economists, because if you make an upfront payment, what this suggests is that they have less incentives to comply because they're getting less money afterwards. But because in this setting, liquidity and trust were big issues, you wanted to have this partial upfront payment. So again, I think when we think of evaluations for project design, we shouldn't think of it that in every case, it's what we're going to use to get to measuring the additionality of the project. But if you have a proof of concept for a class of projects, I think that can be incredibly important in constraining how you actually allow projects to go forward. And that class of projects could potentially be certified on the basis of this sort of gold standard evidence. So you could say, okay, in Uganda, PES systems done with a payment of at least 70,000 shillings are going to have some additionality, roughly take-up rates around 50%. And so you give a set of parameters that anyone else doing PS then has to follow. And I think that is certainly going to be much better than the completely non-transparent ways we see additionality being calculated, which is then featuring into the prices. So the second thing I want to talk about is, who is going to do these evaluations? Who's actually setting, saying how much is being saved? And typically this is coming off a set of third-party verifiers who are often scientists or engineers who are coming in, possibly looking at some satellite imagery in the case of forests, and declaring how much additionality they believe should be. Now, this kind of private third-party expertise is actually growing across the field in environmental regulation, in part because as we become more concerned about issues of pollution and climate change, we need more hands on bodies on the ground. But the typical regulatory agencies are not managing to expand their staff. And so there's been an increased move towards bringing in private sector players like auditors in it. And very often, these are well-trained engineers. They have the expertise, they have the flexibility. And so not just carbon offsets, but even environmental standards like ISO 4001 are increasingly being supported by private auditors. So I'm going to be talking about an example that I worked on with some colleagues of mine, which comes from a state in India that actually decided to put in place third-party auditors. And this was third-party auditors not for carbon measurement, but for pollution. And I think the story for how this happened was interesting is that in the status quo system, the plant itself that was going to need to provide an annual audited report was responsible for hiring and paying the auditor who took the pollution readings and submitted to the regulator. And they were required by law to do this every year. The firms actually ended up taking the regulator to court, saying that these readings were not being used by the regulator and it was expensive for them, so they wanted the system disbanded. The regulator responded that we believe that the data is poor quality, that there is widespread auditor shopping, plants can buy good reports, therefore we don't want to use the data. So the court came back to the Pollution Control Board and said, well, you need to come up with a set of improvements to the system that are sort of credible to us. And then, as researchers, this was completely happenstance. At that time, I was at the Kennedy School at Harvard. The lawyer for this environmental regulator group came to Kennedy School for executive education program and literally walked into my office and said, apparently you do evidence for policy design. And I think that was, the only example in my life where we did research that directly fed into policy, but also meant the regulator was willing to do a field experiment at scale. So we did, this again took 2 years. We did this across roughly 450 industrial plants, largely textile processing in Gujarat. And I think what we did was something that, as economists, we would say would make sense is, first of all, they had a certified list of auditors. And so we just said that take that list of auditors and just randomly assign 2 plants rather than them having choose, and then set a fixed payment. Because one of the problems in the market was that there was just a lot of bird-from competition, a lot of price cutting. And in the end, the price was so low that it was clear it could not support high quality testing. So you could just set a basic price, which is the price it would take to have sufficient lab testing going on. The combination of both of these things, and then of course, there's a question of how do we know this is working? So we did a set of back checks during this period. Finally, I would say, and I'm not going to talk about it, in the second year, we were interested in whether you could do something more sophisticated, for instance, with having a performance pay introduced. But most of the effects we found were really of the fact of this random assignment of auditors and fixed payments. Now, of course, there's some costs. You might say, when firms choose auditors, they choose auditors who know their firms well, have sectoral expertise. So I think these schemes can be made more sophisticated to allow for that. But reducing the complete discretion, especially by payment, was, I think, very important. And this, I think, is something that can quite easily be introduced in the voluntary carbon markets. Let me show you what we found. So this is the status quo. So what you see at the top is just the data submitted by the plants in their reports. And so what you see here is this red line is the regulatory standard. And you see a lot of stacking right under it. So roughly 70% of the mass of readings were within a very small interval of this. These are the back checks that our independent auditors did afterwards. And what you see is a much broader distribution. Now, of course, you see a lot of kind of bad performers who had high emissions are showing up on the right who are now getting stacked. But I think what's important to see is also that there were a lot of good performers who also their data wasn't getting reported because the price had fallen so low that no one could afford to do a lab test. So you were just ticking the box around the mean. And I'd say like the failure of the regulator to get data on the distribution not just mattered for them not being able to discipline in the moment, but also prevented them from introducing more innovative policies, like, for instance, an emissions trading scheme, which this kind of distribution would tell you is very feasible in this setting because there seems to be a lot of variation in abatement. So in the treatment, in contrast, which is the place where we varied how you hired and how you paid, you still see some stacking, but much less. So it goes down from roughly 70% to around 35%. And some of it may be natural, right? That's the kind of Chicago view that people will just undertake as much abatement as they need to. And again, you see a healthy distribution on both sides in the treatment group. So I think this to me is something that can very easily be implemented in these voluntary carbon markets, is to put in place as much more institutional regulation on auditing practices. And then finally, the part we found that I think was important, it wasn't just a change in measurement or reporting. Because the regulator in this area was reasonably credible, once firms knew that better data would be reported, we actually find reductions in pollution. So the pollution in the treatment group falls by roughly 0.2 standard deviations. And these reductions were concentrated among the plants that would historically have gotten the most severe punishments. So I think this is a case where, while the market is voluntary right now, I think it's perfectly feasible to have some set of institutional reforms that could reduce or remove this conflict of interest. There are let me turn to the third part, which is, I think, the most speculative. And I can start by saying I also don't know fully whether this can work, but I definitely think at this point we should be exploring this. So let me start by first talking a little bit about compliance markets and what we have learned about them, even in low state capacity settings. And I want to talk about an example from a low state capacity setting, because if one was to try to introduce any kind of market for voluntary carbon, we are going to end up very often having to function in settings that are relatively low compliance. So just to remind you, how does a classic compliance market work, which right now, as I said, is going to occurs for emissions where everyone in the market is typically an emitter. Some people can buy and sell maybe on a stock market, but you have a governing body. So you have the EU ETS, you have the EU governing body, for instance, or REGIS for SOX in North America, where this governing body is going to set a total cap on permits. And if you want to actually reduce emissions, you do that by reducing the cap on permits. And then you can have different ways in which you provide firms emission permits. And this is the place where you can be as redistributive as you want. So you could kind of give big firms fewer permits, small firms more permits, if you want to not say, make it more costly for one group than another. Given that over a certain time period, the firms know that by the compliance period, by the end of the true-up period, sorry, they have to have as many permits as their emissions, and they can trade for it. Trading is typically transparent. Sometimes you have options for price regulation. The regulator can enter to set up a price floor or price ceiling. And then the government, as I said, sort of is, so to summarize, the government sets the environmental goal, which is the cap. The market is going to set the price. And then they're going to find the cheapest way through trade of reducing these emissions. And the initial allocation will affect the cost to industry. So over the last 10, 12 years, we've actually been working, again, in the state of Gujarat to put such a system in place, but also to experimentally evaluate it. And it's the first experimental evaluation that we know of a cap and trade system. Our advantage for being able to do this was we had enough plants within a certain area that it would be under a single airshed, so you could sensibly set a cap at the level of the airshed for this. As I said, many of these things take many years, and which is why I certainly don't expect a voluntary carbon market to start tomorrow. But I think if you start talking about it and start thinking about what the institutional details may have, there's enough riding on this that hopefully we can make some progress. Just to give you an example of this particular one, we started in 2010 by writing a white paper for the Indian Ministry of Environment and Finance. After that, we had to come up with standards for exactly how you'll measure particulate matter. Then the government set a mandate that industries had to have particulate matter. It took us another 5 years to get the full process greenlit by the central ministry. And then, we launched, like 9 years after we wrote the white paper, we launched this, and then we evaluated it over the next 2 years. What this shows you, the first two mock-up periods, you should not pay a lot of attention to that selection, because at that time they were still installing instruments. But mainly, once we started in period 1, we basically find that the treatment has lower emissions throughout, and that remains constant. This was the COVID period where things were shut down, both pre and post. Now, typically when we think of emissions markets in rich countries, we often don't think about compliance being an issue. So we typically think that emissions will be fixed. This is just the cheapest way of achieving those emission levels. In low-income countries, you're actually possibly also, I think that's an added advantage, you're actually going to move possibly compliance if it's seen as something that the regulator gets better data and is better able to enforce compliance on. And so just to summarize, and I realize I should start wrapping up sometime soon, which I will do. The market worked very well. We saw compliance that was almost perfect, and this levels of high compliance were a significant change from what we saw in the pre-period under the status quo. And I emphasize that because I think that's a huge difference between how these kind of compliance markets work in low state capacity settings, where they often come in not just by saying we'll allow trade, but by actually increasing data transparency a lot. And again, that may well be one advantage we'll see for the voluntary carbon markets if we move in that direction, that we'll see much more transparency. There was active trading, and the permit holdings varied quite widely from the initial allocation. Over the period, we saw a first fall in emissions around 20 to 30%, which was then sustained throughout the period. And then finally, importantly, one of the advantages of using this kind of emissions market is meant to be that you get more cheaper abatement. And we certainly found that while it was costly, it was not very expensive, that this was something that firms were able to do. So let me just show you this graph, which I find quite striking. So this is, I talked about this example for India, but compliance markets have been quite successful both in the US and also in the EU ETS. This is from a recent World Bank study, which shows the difference in the price of a ton of carbon in EU ETS, the UK ETS, the UK WCC verified credit, pending insurance, and the international credit. And what you see is that both in the EU ETS and the UK ETS, the use of a cap has meant a much higher price. It's still probably not as high as it should be, but it's much higher relative to the international carbon credits. And as I said, it's a single market clearing price. Already a first piece of evidence that the compliance markets are not just working better in terms of clearing the market and people maintaining emissions, but they're also getting a price for carbon that seems to be closer, if not at, what we would think as the social cost of carbon. Now, I think we should remember that what compliance markets are trading, and that's going to be one of the big differences if we move ahead with thinking about how this will be operationalized in voluntary credit markets. Basically get a permit that gives you a right to emit today. When we're going to be thinking about this in the carbon offset or the voluntary carbon market, this is often not going to be that. It's often going to be the case that it's going to be a trade in possibly not having carbon emitted ever. In the compliance market, we see legally mandated penalties, and this makes demand predictable. I think, again, this is something in the voluntary carbon market right now, there is no predictability on demand at all. Trading is transparent, and I think importantly, and this is something we saw play out a lot in India, is that both buyers and sellers in the market are very incentivized to monitor others and to make sure that someone else wasn't cheating in the quality of their emissions. The final point, which I think is an important one, is that by treating both buyers and sellers as potential emitters, this whole issue of permanence actually becomes less relevant. And I think this is, again, a question to come back to, but my own sense is I think moving in this direction may also be a good idea for the carbon market. So let's just speculate. What do we think, if you wanted to go down this direction, you would do if you wanted to have this kind of cap and trade market for voluntary cap reduction? Well, the first thing, and that's probably the hardest thing is, but you could start with a small set of players. Right now, where we're getting stuck with this Article 6 negotiation and saying everyone across the world needs to come together and agree on some set of rules for the carbon offset market. This could be a market that people can choose to opt into, but can choose not to opt into also. And hopefully over time, we'll have enough credibility that that's the market that will survive rather than voluntary carbon offsets. So you're going to need a binding legal agreement, which is agreed voluntarily by some, maybe to start with a small set of players who agree to it. And they're going to agree that once they enter this, they will be part of a group that will reduce their collective emissions at some rate. They'll have to set their own emissions target, the quality standards, some are building on some of the work I talked about already. And then you need to establish a regulator. Importantly, and I think this is a part Sam and I are talking about, I realize for national statistics this may cause some issues. This is, I think, a key place you'll have to figure out what to do is, what is being, the reductions here are being funded not by project developers as is happening right now, but by these firms who are entering and trading, right? So it's not a project developer saying, I'm going to sell a carbon offset and use that to, say, implement a PES. You may find that you're going to need firms to be buying carbon credits in excess of what they themselves emit, because they're also funding for instance, these other projects, other investments. And this is going to put you as a firm often in permit debt. And there's a question of what will happen there. I think you have to have a requirement that those who are going to provide credit, they will have to also have a single set of rules, some of which, as we've talked about, have certification on what counts as additionality, having certification on, say, auditors. And then, participants will have to agree to non-compliance penalties, which are going to be much more severe. That's a defining feature of a market. You can't enter a market and then not stick by those rules. And then, they will have to also negotiate with their governments, with statistics agencies, and so on, and ensure there is no double counting. So I think there's a lot to be done here. I certainly don't understand enough very often to understand how we would do this. But I think just given the extraordinary success we've seen of compliance markets and the extraordinary failure we're seeing of the voluntary carbon offset market, and given the fact that to reach our greenhouse gas emissions, we are not going to just rely on people emitting less, but we need to keep carbon in the ground. We possibly need to do some amount of carbon sequestration. I'd argue that this is something we need to start thinking about. And I think my aim in talking about this with this audience is to, learn from many of you and what are the kind of measurement or other issues, or even statistics issues that we would need to start thinking about so that we can actually at least pilot something that looks like this. So I think, if I was to ask what would be my hope is that you can convince some small set of voluntary market participants who are willing to give this a shot. And then we structure an experiment to look at whether this can work and understand the problems. And then, I think just given the amount of resources going into all kinds of engineering climate solutions, I think it's worth putting some amount of resources and actually trying to ask if those engineering solutions are successful, how are we actually going to implement that? And how are we actually going to get that to use markets as the next step to get in the ground? So, and then, of course, if it's successful, which is the dream, then we can imagine it actually, you can either scale it up or it might even just demand from those people buying within this market may drive out others. So let me stop here and open up questions, and thank you very much.
Thank you. So actually, on a personal level, that's immensely timely. Earlier this week, I was at a meeting of a group of representatives from national statistical offices around the world. It was a sprint workshop. And what are the two big things we think that NSOs are possibly going to have to put more emphasis into investing in measurement? And one of the two things, unsurprisingly, was climate change. And there's a lot of discussion about the stuff you've just been talking about. Well, what exactly, where, how to measure, and a real issue about aggregating up, because at one level you have, you've got a global measure, is like we need to get towards 1.5 degrees, and then you have project level measures. But unlike GDP, where GDP you can measure at a global level, at a national level, at a regional level, there was this gap sort of within climate measurement that people thought, although I think I saw Ian Townsend. Ian, are you here? Did I see you somewhere? Nope. My colleague Ian Townsend, if he's here, knows more about this. Do you have any thoughts about sort of this going from kind of, you were talking about some of the project level measures going up to sort of more national level, what should we be measuring at a more national level?
I think part of that is going to be really setting up this idea of what is the remaining space.
Okay.
Right. So I think the way you're going to get to it is to say for a country to be net zero, which I think countries are thinking about now, how much emissions can they afford to have? Once you have that ceiling, I think that's going to be something that should be ideally pushing up the price of a bunch of these kind of well-certified projects and getting us closer to a social cost of carbon. And when you're trying to do things like offset your flight.
Okay, right. Questions from, hand up right away. Go for it. Oh, hang on, microphone. Let me go to Slido.
You talk about this framework for carbon and in particular. Do you envision this framework being used for other pollutions and plastics or other things? Is one of the aims to get this system right so that you can apply it to other things like future
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, when the example I talked about, the experiment I started with, the reason why we ended up doing it for particulate matter was because I think in 2010, no one in the Indian government was willing to talk about carbon markets. That has been transformed now, but at that time where we could enter and we could make progress was on PM. So I think once you do that, and in each of these, I think the critical step is going to be measurement. It took us like 5 years to figure out how to actually show that you could use basically these light-based spectrometers to measure particulate matter in stacks and then actually get it nationally mandated. I suspect if you did plastic or something else, it'd be the same question to start with, be a set of measurement questions we'd have to think about. I honestly think that's the key. Once you've got the measurement and you've got the mandates around it and you've got data security that works, I think markets that trade are relatively easy to put in place after that.
Sonia, you had a... No.
Thanks, Sonia Carrera from ONS. A couple of questions. One is whether you have done any study on the behavioral impact of the carbon offsetting.
Sorry,
so for
what?
Behavioral impact.
Yeah.
So for example, are people flying more than what they would do if there wasn't that carbon offsetting? And then the other question is that most of what you discussed is on mitigation. Have you done, or is there any example of activities that are adaptation instead of mitigation in terms of response to the carbon produced or other pollution? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I think the behavioral question is super important, this idea that there may be a rebound where people do more. I haven't personally studied it. I know people have done a lot of this in the context of energy efficiency, for example, of showing that there does seem to be some rebound effect. I think the main thing I'd say that holds across the board, once you account for these behavioral effects, is why you cannot rely on engineering estimates. And so I think in general, I think just whatever we can do to stop relying so much on engineering estimates would be critical for accounting for this behavior. I think adaptation is critical. I think a lot of people would say that, especially when we're thinking of lower income countries. So for instance, when we think about the loss and damage fund that came out of the recent COP, there is, for low income countries, it's less about mitigation, it's more about just adaptation. I think yes and no, that may be true for some set of, like I work in 2 countries, Nepal and India, which are to me contrasting extremes, right? They're both suffering a lot, they need a lot of adaptation. But India is also going to be a huge player in the mitigation space. And so trying to think about how you bring those two together. There's some amount of discussion right now about can you have a carbon credit system where, let's say, poor farmers or others for whom it's become, it's too hot, it's hard to do, whether they can actually enter these kind of these markets as actually sellers of green credit. I think the current government's very keen to start this green credit from poor farmers. So that would be one way you could imagine bringing together adaptation and mitigation, as if they can enter in some ways as providers of green credit or monitors of it. But otherwise, I think we have to work on both margins at the same time. I mean, the other thing I would say, now think about it, is you could imagine that if this market works well, you could actually earn revenue that could go for adaptation. I think that's already happening in RGGI in California, that the money that they earn from the market there, which is a carbon market, not RGGI, so the California market, that is required to go towards adaptation activities in part.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Paul Eakins from University College London, and this is very much one of my research areas as well, and I much enjoyed your talk, so thank you very much. I too had long come to the conclusion that the voluntary carbon market was a complete failure and could not be made to work without some element of regulation. I'm also a fan of the compliance markets, which do seem to work well. One of the great distinctions between the experiment that you were giving with your particulates and the carbon market, of course, is that among the club of companies that were reducing their particulate emissions, the emissions reductions took place within the club.
Exactly.
Whereas in a regulated carbon market of the kind that you're talking about, you would actually have the participants putting aside a sum of money in order to make reductions somewhere else.
Exactly, and that's the permit deficit part that I think is tricky.
And clearly that somewhere else, how you permit and allow that somewhere else, and then in addition, how you audit it, you talked about very eloquently and would be really interesting. The other element, which I think is really interesting, is to do it within a cap. And of course, the compliance markets that work have a cap, as you pointed out. And at the moment, these voluntary carbon markets have no cap at all. The issue would be that if you try to keep within the 1.5 degree cap, and I'm among those climate-related people who think that we're well past the 1.5 now, but let's say that we're going to keep it to whatever we got, 250 gigatons of carbon to go for that, the prices will be very high indeed if you are going to keep within that cap. And I just wonder whether you've had any thoughts about whether anyone would participate in that, given that the prices are where they would have to be, so that in a way one might kill off the market entirely because the prices were too high, which they will need to be. And if governments are serious about the Paris Agreement targets, they will need to regulate such that carbon reaches those prices. But I wonder whether in a voluntary sense where you can join, whether actually you'd find anyone joining that or not.
Thanks. I think you've hit on two of the things that certainly I'm still puzzling over. The first one I think is key. And that's what I said, that you're going to have these firms that are in some way going to be in permit deficit, and I'm not very sure how that's going to work. And that's what I love to think more about. I can see how you can get people coming in as credit providers who are well regulated, well certified, but figuring out how these firms are going to be treated, who are in some sense not undertaking their own, they're not reducing their own emissions, but they're paying these other guys to do it. What that means, I think, is something we're going to have to think about. So I completely agree on that. The second one, I think one interesting question is, and again, this is going to be, I think, kind of legally matter at a later stage, is how much one needs to start with 1.5. My idea for the experiment was that if you start with a voluntary group, you start with a cap that we say gets you something to somewhat agreed social cost of carbon right now. That's not super high. Probably is going to exceed 1.5 if scaled up, but you should do a proof of concept. Even in the example we did in the PM, we actually were able to bring the cap down over time, because to start with, the government was very concerned about what the prices would be. And then we showed them that if you made the cap too lax, then you're just hitting the floor price all the time. And then they were willing to bring it down. Now we have reasonable movement. It's still like, it's like for PM, it's like we 12 rupees per kilo, where the floor price is 5. So it's not a super high. I think the trick will be how you go from some kind of small experiment where we maybe figure out more of the first stage to something that you can scale up, where you're going to have to take seriously these agreements. So I think both points are very well taken. I think I don't have any answers to them.
Joe. No, not Joe, sorry. Sanjeev. Drop 2 mics.
Thanks, Osama. I don't think I've ever been accused of needing 2 microphones, but never mind. I think Paul's touched on some of the things I want to cover, but I won't do that, but I'm going to link it. So there's 2 aspects. One is on the measurement. Now, the developed countries come up with ideas, patents, etc., and shift the production to the lesser developed countries. So the carbon emissions picture, etc., looks very skewed. Who is actually owning those and who's driving those? And obviously in the COP, you have the developed countries not really honoring their obligations, etc. What do you think can be done to force them to change that practice is one question. And the second question is, I think we've gone well beyond the voluntary domain. What do you think it will trigger to have mandatory actions, a string of mandatory actions to address what we're concerned about? Thanks.
This is a hard question. I'm going to start with the second, where I think it's an interesting question of whether you can have now a set of players that are not going to be national governments, which are going to be willing to enter agreements that bind them because they have enough, say, consumer demand. I mean, the question is, for instance, plane companies, the Deltas and the other the world, who are facing huge, whether they actually see it in their business interest to start entering these kind of binding on them voluntary arrangements. And I don't know, maybe I'm overly pessimistic. I feel like that's the way we're going to do it, is by having this sort of consumer pressure hit firms and they enter something, and then maybe that scales up over time. Because I don't see that political action right now at the national government level to move it.
broader question, just because we're just beginning to play. I mean, data collection in general is quite expensive. In development contexts, it's often involve people on the ground collecting data. And we are in our infancy in the Office for National Statistics in terms of using Earth observation data, and we're just using it within RGB, not some of the wider spectrum stuff. I mean, it's availability of new sort of forms of data. Do you think that's going to change how development economics is done, or probably not the theory, but just more on the measurement side?
I think some. So let me just say two things. One, I'm going to just bring it back, being parochial to climate, and then I'll answer the broader question. Is I think one thing that I think I've been pushing, but I think social scientists should be pushing a lot more for, is to think of implementation as much of an important climate technology as the amount of resources going to things like geoengineering. I feel like, you know, we don't have all the solutions in the climate field. We have a lot of pretty good technologies that are producing results now. We're just having an impossible time implementing that because we're not getting legal frameworks, we're not getting regulation. I think if you can make that change, I think there'll be more money, hopefully, flowing into that area than there is. On the second thing, yes, I think there's huge potential. My fear is it's a little bit like, I think you were talking this morning about how you feel you're now beyond the kind of initial glow of AI. I think like certainly if you think about working in this space, and if you think of forest, an important thing, people are super excited about satellite imagery, right? But in order to actually make satellite imagery or remote sensing really functional, you also need digital cadastrals. You need someone on the ground, ground truthing a bunch of this data. So I think for us to really leverage all this exciting new data, we have to recognize there's going to be a part of it, which is kind of ground truthing and recognizing it. But also, you're just going to need things like people will need property rights. And so a lot of the old fashioned part of development, which is how do we have property rights? I don't think those are going to go away, but they can certainly be supplemented. But I think a lot of people who kind of wish they can do away with all the kind of problems of weak institutions and just rely on AI and remote sensing to solve those problems. And that may not happen.
Okay. Oh.
I have a question, which might be a bit controversial. So addressing the issue of leakage with this, we could imagine once you have a functional market with a bunch of players that are involved, there might be a bit of offshoring that goes down. So countries that are highly industrialized might be willing to pay more in order to continue the activity of economic activity that's going on. Does that have implication in terms of economic diversification and convergence for countries that kind of working towards catching up to the global mean or whatever? So do you see countries that might choose to instead kind of work towards having this offset or making money through offsetting and instead not focusing on like developing or technologies and stuff that would bring them closer to the industrialized?
I don't think of that as a controversial question. I think there's a question at the heart of what we're thinking about. And the question, you're putting it in terms of national governments. A lot of the concern right now is private players. So if you look at, for instance, I forget the name, as a Blue Carbon, I think this sort of UAE-based company that's buying huge hordes of land across sub-Saharan Africa in places like Zimbabwe. And I think they bought up something like a third of Zimbabwe for selling in a carbon offset market. But of course, this is money that the Zimbabwean national government is getting. It's not the farmers who would have used that getting it otherwise. So I think that's a huge question. I mean, I think we have to tackle that head on, which is to say that if you're going to say that you can't develop a lot of space and things like that, you are actually reducing economic opportunities. Now, is it the case that you can leapfrog a bit with services and digital technologies so that those kind of traditional ways aren't important for growth? Maybe, but at the same time, there's also food security. So I think those are all issues that if we don't address, we're not going to make progress on. And at some level, as he said, this is all going to show up in the price. And that, I think we have to ask those questions because otherwise there is a real concern that right now what's happening, to the extent anything's happening, this carbon offset market is particularly unfair, especially I think in areas, not just, I think maybe less in the Amazon, but certainly in countries like DRC, which are an important contributor of forest land, but are also very poor countries.
Okay, we have time for one more.
There's one question there.
What do you see as the possibilities around countries coming together to agree on collective emission targets for the legally binding context of delay emission control?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of a little bit given up on countries as the unit of analysis, as you may have seen, for precisely those reasons. I think maybe a set of COPs that have not worked very well. I do think in the short run, I wonder whether more of this action is going to come from private players who are either facing pressure from consumers or otherwise. So I agree with you. I think it's going to be hard. I mean, the one thing that I didn't talk about much, and I should just mention it, even though I don't have very coherent thoughts on it, is how this carbon adjustment border taxes are going to play into all of this as well. I think that's one place where the national unit is going to matter. And I think what EU is doing there is going to show up quite a lot. But at the same time, Biden just announced a huge set of tariffs on electric vehicles from China. That's presumably not going to be good for decarbonization.
Okay. That was brilliant. Very timely, very relevant. Important questions for all of us about what we're measuring and how. So can I just on behalf of everyone say thank you once again.
Thank you very much for inviting me.